Franklin, Tennessee, has always prided itself on its family values. This town of 40,000 people, located 20 miles south of Nashville, was famous for its historic homes, well-kept neighborhoods, and strong marriages. Divorces were less common than the national average, and Sunday services at local churches drew packed houses. The Harris family was one that other Franklin residents looked upon with envy and admiration. Alvin Harris, the 42-year-old owner of Harris Construction, had built his business from the ground up over the past 15 years. His company specialized in building private homes and small commercial buildings and had an impeccable reputation in the county. Alvin personally supervised every project, and he could often be seen on construction sites in his work clothes, discussing details with the builders. His wife, Sandra, had been a loan officer at Franklin Community Bank for 12 years. At 38, she retained the grace and charm that had captivated Alvin back in college. Sandra was known for her professionalism and ability to find solutions to the most complex loan cases. Her colleagues respected her for her honesty and attention to detail. The couple had 2 children, 16-year-old Emily, who was in her senior year at the local high school and dreamed of attending Vanderbilt University, and 14-year-old Josh, the star of the school basketball team. The children were their parents' pride and joy, honor students, active participants in school life, polite and responsible. The Harris' house on Maple Street was the embodiment of the American dream. It was a 2-story colonial-style building with white columns and black shutters, surrounded by a perfectly manicured lawn and flower beds that Sandra planted herself every spring. Inside, the house was tastefully furnished, not luxuriously, but solidly and comfortably. There was a living room with a fireplace where the family spent their evenings, a kitchen with granite countertops where Sandra cooked family dinners, and a family room with a large TV for watching sports. On weekends, Alvin often worked in the yard, trimming the hedge, repairing the fence, washing the cars. The neighbors were used to seeing him in old jeans and a work shirt, focused on his chores. He always found time to chat with his neighbors over the fence, discuss the weather, local news, or give advice on repairs. The family regularly attended St. John's Methodist Church. Every Sunday morning, the Harrises would show up at the service in their best clothes. Alvin in a formal suit and tie, Sandra in an elegant dress, and the children in matching outfits. After the service, they often stayed for community events, charity bazaars, lunches for elderly parishioners, children's parties. Alvin was known for his generosity. When misfortunes struck the city, fires, floods, family tragedies, his company often offered free assistance with restoration. He donated materials and labor without expecting public recognition. The local newspaper, the Franklin Daily Post, wrote about his charitable activities several times. The family was filled with love and mutual understanding. At least, that's how it seemed to everyone around them. Alvin and Sandra often held hands in public, exchanged tender glances, and supported each other in conversation. They always attended their children's school events together, cheered for Josh at basketball games, and applauded Emily at school concerts. However, those who knew the family better sometimes noticed something strange. Mary Johnson, the Harris' neighbor, once mentioned to her husband that Alvin often left in the evenings, citing work. "It's strange that construction work requires so much night work," she said thoughtfully. Her husband Tom shrugged. "Business is business. Maybe he's meeting with clients or checking security at the sites." Sandra also noticed changes in her husband's behavior, but tried not to attach any importance to them. Alvin became more withdrawn at home, often spending his evenings in his study, buried in his computer. When she came in with a cup of coffee, he quickly closed his browser or switched to work documents. "Just a lot of orders," he explained, smiling tensely. Their intimacy had also changed. Alvin used to be a tender and attentive lover, but in recent years he had become more distant. Sandra attributed this to work fatigue and age. After all, they were both over 40. But sometimes she had disturbing thoughts, especially late at night when she lay awake and Alvin slept with his back to the wall. The children didn't seem to notice anything. Emily was absorbed in preparing for her final exams and planning for college. Josh devoted himself entirely to basketball and dreams of a sports scholarship. To them, their father remained a hero, a successful businessman who could solve any problem and always found time for their needs. Alvin really tried to be a good father. He never missed Josh's important games, drove Emily to SAT prep classes, and helped both of them with their math homework. On Saturday mornings, he made his famous pancakes for the whole family, and the kitchen was filled with laughter and chatter. But a careful observer might have noticed that Alvin's smile sometimes didn't reach his eyes, that he would sometimes pause in the middle of a conversation as if his thoughts were somewhere far away, that his phone would ring at odd times and he would go into another room to answer it. Alvin's workday started early. By 6 in the morning, he was already drinking coffee in the kitchen, checking the weather report and his plans for the day. By 7, he was at his company's office, a small one-story building on the industrial outskirts of Franklin. There, craftsmen, blueprints, and phone calls from customers awaited him. Alvin was proud that he knew the names of all 23 of his employees, remembered their children's birthdays, and took an interest in their family affairs. Harris Construction had contracts throughout the county, ranging from small repairs to the construction of entire neighborhoods of private homes. Alvin personally supervised large projects, often spending 8 to 10 hours a day on construction sites. He was known as a demanding but fair boss who never asked his subordinates to do anything he wouldn't do himself. But in the last 2 years, something had changed in his work habits. Secretary Debbie Morgan, who had been with the company for 7 years, noticed that her boss had begun to frequently leave for client meetings in the afternoon. These meetings were not listed in his regular schedule, and Debbie received no instructions on how to organize them. When she asked for details to keep his calendar up to date, Alvin replied evasively, "These are preliminary negotiations, nothing definite." Alvin also became more attentive to his appearance. He started buying expensive clothes, changed his old haircut to a more modern one, and started wearing perfume. Sandra was initially pleased with these changes. It seemed to her that her husband had started taking care of himself again, perhaps going through a midlife crisis and trying to regain his youth. Evening business meetings became regular. Alvin explained them as necessary for expanding the business, finding new clients, and attending industry events. "You know how competitive the construction industry is these days," he told Sandra. "I have to work not only during the day but also establish connections in the evenings." Sandra believed her husband. Over the course of 20 years of marriage, they had disagreements, minor quarrels, and periods of cooling off, but she never suspected Alvin of infidelity. He seemed too decent for that, too devoted to his family. Besides, when he had time, he was still an attentive husband, bringing her flowers for no reason, remembering anniversaries, planning family vacations. Their last vacation last year in Myrtle Beach was wonderful. The whole family spent a week on the ocean coast, playing volleyball on the beach, dining at local restaurants, and boating. Alvin seemed relaxed and happy, joking with the children and taking romantic walks with Sandra along the shore at sunset. Photos from that vacation still adorned the refrigerator in their home. But even then, there were strange moments. Alvin received several text messages that made him frown. When Sandra asked who was writing, he replied, "Work stuff. Jim is checking on the construction site on Oak Street." But for some reason, he deleted these messages immediately after reading them, even though his phone was usually full of work correspondence. The country inn on the outskirts of Franklin wasn't known for its luxury, but it provided what Alvin needed most: anonymity. Built in the 90s, the 2-story building with a faded red roof attracted mostly passing truckers and the occasional business traveler. Alvin knew that the chances of running into someone he knew here were practically zero. Brian Thompson was waiting for him in room 237. The 35-year-old insurance agent sat in the only chair by the window, smoking nervously and staring out at the parking lot. When Alvin entered, using his copy of the key card, Brian didn't turn around right away. "You're 20 minutes late," he said, not hiding his irritation. Josh was late for practice. I had to pick him up, Alvin said, sitting down on the edge of the bed, keeping his distance. In the 3 years of their relationship, he had learned to read Brian's mood by his posture and tone of voice. Always family, Brian finally turned around. His dark hair was tousled, his eyes red from lack of sleep. Sometimes I feel like I'm dating a ghost. Alvin understood his frustration. Their relationship existed in stolen hours and stolen moments. Meetings in motels, quick phone calls from the car, rare weekend trips under the guise of business conferences. It was a love in the shadows, a relationship with no future, which both men had been carrying on for 3 years. They met at a building materials trade show in Nashville. Brian represented an insurance company specializing in commercial properties, and Alvin was looking for favorable terms for his construction projects. A business conversation over coffee quietly turned into a personal conversation, then dinner at the hotel restaurant, and then Alvin still remembered that first kiss in the elevator. Sudden, frightening, it destroyed all his preconceptions about himself. At 40, he fell truly in love with a man for the first time, although vague attractions had haunted him since adolescence. "I'm sorry," Alvin approached Brian and put his hands on his shoulders. "I know it's hard. It's hard for me, too." Brian leaned back in his chair, accepting the touch. He had his own family in Nashville, his wife Carol and 2 small children. His situation was no less complicated than Alvin's. 2 married men leading double lives clung to each other like a lifeline in an ocean of lies. "How are things at home?" Alvin asked, sitting down on the armrest of the chair. "Carol suspects," Brian said, stubbing out his cigarette in the ashtray. "Yesterday she asked why I go to Franklin so often. She said there aren't enough clients here to justify constant trips." Alvin felt the familiar chill of fear in his stomach. Exposure was their shared nightmare. In conservative Tennessee, where they had both built their reputations and businesses, scandal would mean not only the end of their marriages, but professional death. "What did you tell her?" "That I'm expanding my client base. That the construction boom requires more insurance services." Brian smiled bitterly. "The same set of excuses as always." Alvin put his arm around his shoulders. Physical intimacy with Brian was completely different from that with Sandra. Not better or worse, just different. With his wife, he had the habit and comfort of a 20-year relationship. With Brian, there was passion, danger, a feeling of complete openness that was both frightening and intoxicating. They spent 2 hours in the room. They talked about work, children, plans for the future that would never come to fruition. They made love with the desperation of people who knew that time was against them. Alvin left first, as always. Brian waited half an hour before leaving the hotel. But Brian wasn't the only secret in Alvin's life. The Crossroads Bar was located 30 miles from Franklin, in a small town where no one knew Alvin. It was a typical working-class establishment, dark, smoky, with cheap beer and pool tables. But on Friday nights, a special crowd gathered here. Men who, like Alvin, were looking for something they couldn't find at home. Jason Miller had been working as a bartender at Crossroads for 4 years. A 28-year-old guy with tattoos on his arms and a piercing in his ear, he was the complete opposite of Brian. An openly gay man who made no secret of his orientation, Jason lived the life Alvin could only dream of. "Hey, stranger," Jason grinned as Alvin approached the bar. "Haven't seen you in a month." "Been busy," Alvin ordered a whiskey on the rocks. In this bar, he was just Al, a builder from the neighboring county. No one knew his real name, address, or marital status. "You're always busy," Jason poured the drink, his gaze lingering on Alvin's hands. "The wedding ring is still there, I see." Alvin instinctively covered his left hand with his right. He never took the ring off, even here. It was his reminder of another life, an anchor that kept him from completely sinking into this world. "It's complicated," he said simply. "Everything is difficult for you." Jason shook his head. Someday you'll have to choose. They met irregularly, maybe once a month or two. Their connection was purely physical, without the emotional attachment that bound Alvin to Brian. With Jason, he could be what he wasn't at home or with Brian. Just a man who desired another man without complicated explanations or justifications. That night, they went to Jason's small apartment above an auto parts store. Alvin knew it was risky to leave the car on the street where it could be seen, but alcohol dulled his caution. Jason was young, handsome, and didn't demand emotional commitment. That was what scared Alvin the most. After midnight, lying in a strange bed and listening to the steady breathing of the young man sleeping next to him, Alvin thought about his life. How did he end up here? When did lying become second nature to him? It all started in high school. Vague fantasies about his classmates, which he diligently suppressed. Dates with girls who seemed right, but didn't really spark any real desire. Meeting Sandra in college was a lifesaver. She was beautiful, smart, kind. With her, he felt normal, able to play the role of a typical heterosexual man. For 20 years, he convinced himself that this role was his real life. He loved Sandra, in his own way, honestly, deeply. He loved his children more than life itself. He built a house, a business, a reputation. But something inside him always remained hungry, unsatisfied. The first betrayal happened 5 years ago. A business trip to Atlanta, a conference on construction technology, a hotel bar, a chance encounter with a man. Alvin still remembered his name, Robert, an architect from Georgia. They spent one night together, and for 3 months after that, Alvin couldn't sleep peacefully because of shame and self-flagellation. But the hunger didn't go away. On the contrary, once awakened, it grew stronger. Alvin began looking for excuses to travel, researching LGBT communities in neighboring cities, creating a complex system of lies that allowed him to lead a double life. Meeting Brian changed everything. For the first time in 40 years, Alvin fell truly in love. Not with a role, not with the idea of normality, with a specific person. It was both a liberation and a curse. Rationalization became his companion. It's not cheating if I love my wife, he told himself. It's just a part of me that she can't understand. I'm a good father and husband. That doesn't negate everything else. It's better than destroying the family with a divorce. Alvin created a complex system of excuses in his head. He really loved his family. That wasn't a lie. He provided for them, protected them, participated in their lives. His relationships with men existed in a parallel universe that was not supposed to intersect with his home life. I'm not hurting anyone, he repeated to himself on the way home after meeting with Brian or Jason. Sandra is happy. The kids are happy. Everyone is getting what they need. But the lie required constant effort. Every day, Alvin had to remember what he had said, to whom, and when. He had to keep 2 phones, one for work and one for personal use. He had to delete his browser history. He had to come up with plausible explanations for his absences. He had to control every word, every glance, every reaction. The worst moments were when the 2 worlds threatened to collide. Like the time Sandra suggested going with him to a construction trade show in Nashville, the very one where he planned to meet Brian. Or when Josh asked why his father worked so often in the evenings. Couldn't he hire an assistant? Dad just wants to give us a better life, Sandra replied for him, and Alvin felt his heart tighten with guilt. The children believed in him unconditionally. Emily often told her friends that she had the best father in the world. Josh dreamed of working with his father in the construction company when he grew up. Their trust was both a gift and a torment. Alvin knew he was playing with fire, that sooner or later the truth would come out, but he couldn't stop. His relationship with Brian gave him emotional satisfaction that he couldn't find anywhere else. Casual encounters with other men allowed him to release the tension that had built up. Deep down, he dreamed of a different life, a world where he could be honest with himself and those around him, where he wouldn't have to hide, lie, or play roles. But Franklin, Tennessee, 2025, that world wasn't ready for his truth. And he wasn't ready to lose everything for the sake of freedom. So Alvin continued to live a double life, balancing between family and passion, between social expectations and personal needs. Every day, he put on the mask of a model family man and wore it for so long that sometimes he forgot where the mask ended and the real him began. Sandra Harris had always prided herself on her attention to detail. This trait made her one of the best credit managers at Franklin Community Bank. She could spot discrepancies in documents that others missed or sensed when a borrower was hiding something. That same intuition now haunted her at home. The first thing that alarmed her was the laundry. On Saturdays, Sandra traditionally did the housework, and she found a note with an address in a neighboring county in Alvin's shirt pocket. When she asked her husband about it at breakfast, he replied without looking up from the newspaper, "A potential property. The client wants to build a house there." The explanation sounded reasonable, but something in his tone seemed unnatural to her. Alvin usually talked enthusiastically about new projects, discussed plans, and asked her opinion on the design. This time, he quickly changed the subject to the children's schoolwork. The next alarming call came 2 weeks later. Sandra used Alvin's phone to call her mother. Her own phone was dead. Leafing through the contacts looking for her mother's number, she came across several names she didn't recognize. BT was listed as BTS Insurance, but for some reason, this designation seemed strange to her. Alvin usually listed business contacts with the full names of companies. At the same time, she noticed that Alvin had become more secretive with his phone. He used to leave it on the kitchen table when he went to take a shower or ask her to answer the phone if his hands were full. Now he always had his cell phone with him, lying face down, and when messages came in, he read them quickly and deleted them. "Who was that?" she asked one evening when Alvin read a message and immediately deleted it. "Jim from the Oak Street site. Problems with material delivery," he replied, putting his phone in his pocket. But Sandra knew that Jim Wilson, Alvin's foreman, usually called instead of texting. Besides, the Oak Street project had been completed a month ago. Her suspicions really began on a Thursday evening in March. Alvin left for another business meeting, saying he would be back late. Sandra decided to bake his favorite apple pie as a surprise. At 10 p.m., when the pie was ready and Alvin was still gone, she called him. "The meeting is running late," he said, and she could hear sounds in the background that did not sound like a business discussion at all. Soft music was playing, and someone was laughing in the background. "I'll be home in an hour." Alvin came home at 11:30 with the smell of cigarettes in his hair. Sandra knew that her husband had quit smoking 8 years ago and couldn't stand tobacco smoke. When she gently asked about the smell, he explained that the meeting had taken place in a restaurant where smoking was allowed. "I thought you knew I can't stand smoking establishments," Sandra said, studying his face. "The client chose the place." "I didn't want to argue over something so trivial," Alvin said quickly, changing his clothes and going to take a shower. Lying awake that night, Sandra analyzed the changes in her husband's behavior over the past few months. More frequent evening outings, new clothes he bought without consulting her, perfume she didn't choose, detachment in bed. Alvin used to be a tender and attentive lover, but now their intimacy had become mechanical, devoid of emotional connection. The most disturbing thing was the change in his gaze. Before, when Alvin looked at her, she saw love, desire, warmth. Now there was often an absent thoughtfulness in his eyes, as if he were somewhere far away, even when he was physically close. The next day, Sandra decided to conduct her own investigation. During her lunch break, she drove to her husband's office on the pretext of inviting him to lunch. Debbie Morgan, Alvin's secretary, looked confused. "Mr. Harris left for a client meeting about an hour ago," she said. "He didn't say when he'd be back." "Who is he meeting with?" Sandra asked as casually as possible. "I might know these people." Debbie shrugged uncertainly. He didn't say. He just said he needed to look at a site in Brentwood. Brentwood was a 40-minute drive from Franklin. Sandra knew the area. Expensive houses, gated communities. It was unlikely that Alvin's company would get a contract there without preliminary negotiations, which he would surely have mentioned. That evening, she tried to gently probe for details. "How did the meeting in Brentwood go?" she asked over dinner. Alvin hesitated for a second. "Good. Promising project." Still in the discussion stage. "What kind of people? How did they find out about your company?" "Recommendations?" Alvin focused on his plate. "You know how it is. Some clients recommend others." But Sandra noticed that he was avoiding her gaze, and his left hand was trembling slightly as he brought his fork to his mouth. In 20 years of marriage, she had learned his habits. Alvin always got nervous when he lied. The decisive moment came on Friday. Alvin said he was going to a construction trade show in Nashville and would be back late. Sandra decided to check up on him. She couldn't find any information online about any construction trade shows in Nashville or the surrounding area that weekend. So she did something she had never done in all their years of marriage. She started following her husband. On Saturday morning, Sandra told the children she was going to a friend's house to do some shopping and headed for Alvin's office. His pickup truck was in the parking lot. She parked across the street, behind a grocery store, where she had a good view of the exit. At 9:30, Alvin left and headed not toward Nashville, but south on Highway 31. Sandra followed him at a safe distance, knowing every turn thanks to 15 years of driving on these roads. Alvin drove through 3 small towns and stopped at the Country Inn Motel on the outskirts of Columbia. Sandra parked behind the gas station across the street and watched. Alvin didn't go into the motel office, but headed straight for the second floor, took a key card out of his pocket, and opened the door to room 237. So he had been here before, repeatedly. 40 minutes later, a silver Honda Accord pulled up to the motel. An unfamiliar man about Alvin's age got out of the car, slender, dark-haired, wearing a business suit. He also headed straight for room 237 and entered without knocking. Sandra felt the ground slip away beneath her feet. Her husband was meeting another man at a motel. All possible explanations, a business meeting, a coincidence, a mistake, fell apart in the face of the fact that both men had keys to the same room. She sat in her car for 2 hours, unable to believe what was happening. At 12:30, the man in the suit came out first, got into his Honda, and drove away. Half an hour later, Alvin appeared. Even from a distance, she could see that he looked relaxed and satisfied. He got into his pickup truck and drove home. Sandra got home before him and was sitting in the kitchen drinking cold coffee when Alvin returned. He looked fresh and cheerful, as if he had really spent the day at a trade show. "How was the show?" she asked, trying to keep her tone normal. "Great. Lots of new technology, interesting materials." Alvin kissed her on the cheek. "Sorry I'm so late. The traffic in Nashville is terrible. Did you buy anything? Did you bring any brochures?" Alvin hesitated for a moment. "Everything is electronic now. They gave us links to websites." The lie came so naturally to him that Sandra realized this wasn't the first time. Perhaps he had been lying to her for months or even years. That night, she lay next to her husband, who was snoring quietly, and tried to make sense of what was happening. 20 years of marriage, 2 children, a shared home, a business, plans for the future, and all of it was built on lies. Her husband had been leading a double life, meeting men in motels, and she had no idea. The worst part was realizing how blind she had been. How many times had she excused his strange behavior, chalking up the changes to fatigue or stress? How many business meetings were actually dates? On Monday, Sandra made a decision that changed her life forever. She hired a private investigator. Ray McConnell was a retired police officer who had opened a private agency in a neighboring county. Sandra found him on the internet, choosing someone who was far enough away from Franklin that there was no risk of running into acquaintances. "I suspect my husband of cheating," she said, sitting in his modest office above an insurance agency. Ray, a man in his 50s with a gray mustache and tired eyes, nodded. "Pretty standard situation. Do you want photos, documents, or just confirmation?" "I want to know the truth. The whole truth." A week later, Sandra had the photos. Alvin and an unfamiliar man at a motel. Alvin in a bar she had never seen before, talking to a young man with tattoos. Alvin kissing the same dark-haired man in the parking lot of a shopping center in Nashville. Ray gave her other information as well. The dark-haired man's name was Brian Thompson. He worked as an insurance agent, was married, and had 2 children. The young bartender's name was Jason Miller. He was openly gay and worked at an LGBT-friendly establishment outside the county. "Judging by the regularity of their meetings, this has been going on for quite some time," Ray said, handing her the report folder. "Your husband seems to have a serious relationship with Thompson. They've been meeting twice a week for several months." Sandra looked at the photos and felt her whole world crumbling. In one of them, Alvin was hugging Brian as tenderly as he hadn't hugged her in years. In another, they were walking down the street holding hands, both looking happy. "There's something else," Ray added cautiously. "It looks like your husband is using gay dating apps. I tracked his online activity. This isn't just an affair, it's a lifestyle." At home, Sandra locked herself in the bathroom and cried for a long time. Then she washed her face with cold water, looked at herself in the mirror, and made a decision. She had to talk to Alvin. She had to hear the truth from him. But first, she had to decide if she was ready for what he might say, and if she was ready for the consequences of that conversation. Friday, March 7th, began as a normal day at the Harris's house. Alvin left for work at 7 in the morning. Sandra took the children to school and went to the bank. Emily stayed late for school choir practice, and Josh stayed for evening basketball practice. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the couple were home alone. Sandra had spent 3 days thinking about how to start the conversation. The folder with the private investigator's report was in her desk, and the photos were hidden in the safe. Every time she looked at Alvin at dinner or listened to his stories about work, she felt anger mixed with pain and despair growing inside her. "Alvin, we need to talk," she said when he settled down in the living room with the TV remote. "Sure. What about?" He turned on the sports channel without looking at her. "Turn off the TV. This is serious." Something in her tone made him turn around. Sandra stood in the doorway, holding a folder. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Where were you last Saturday?" she asked. "At the exhibition in Nashville." "I told you." Alvin frowned. "Sandy, what's going on?" There was no trade show. She entered the living room and placed the folder on the coffee table. "I checked. There were no construction trade shows in Nashville that weekend." Alvin felt a cold knot of fear form in his stomach. "Maybe you misunderstood. It was a small industry meeting, not... You were at the Country Inn Motel in Columbia." Sandra opened the folder and took out the first photo. "With this man." In the photo, Alvin and Brian were standing at the entrance to room 237. Alvin looked at the picture and his face slowly turned pale. "Sandy, it's not what you think. Don't you dare." Sandra's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "Don't you dare lie to me anymore. I have photos, reports, recordings of your phone calls. I know about Brian Thompson. I know about Jason the bartender. I know about the dating apps." Alvin covered his face with his hands. 20 years of lies collapsed in a second. "How long have you known?" 2 weeks. I hired a private investigator." Sandra laid the photos out on the table one by one. "Want to see them all? Here you are kissing him in the parking lot. Here you are entering a gay bar. Here you are hugging him the way you haven't hugged me in years." "Sandy, please, let me explain." "Explain what? That 20 years of our marriage were a lie? That you cheated on me with men while I was raising your children and believing in our family? Alvin got up from the sofa and tried to approach her, but Sandra backed away. It's not a lie. I love you. I love the children. Our family is built on your lies. Sandra's voice broke into a scream. You slept with men, and then you came home and lay down in the same bed with me. You kissed me with those same lips. That doesn't change how I feel about you. Shut up! Sandra grabbed one of the photos and waved it in front of his face. Can you feel it? Look at yourself. Look how you look at him. When was the last time you looked at me like that? Alvin couldn't find the words. In the photo, he was indeed looking at Brian with a tenderness he hadn't shown Sandra in years. How long has this been going on? She asked. Sandy. How long? The first time was 5 years ago, but it was an accident, a business trip. I was drunk. And with this, Brian. 3 years, Alvin admitted quietly. Sandra felt the room begin to spin. 3 years. For 3 years, he had lied to her every day, kissed her goodnight, made love to her, planned family vacations, and all the while he had another life. Do you love him? The question came out almost as a whisper. Alvin was silent for too long. The silence was enough. My God! Sandra sank into a chair. You love him more than you love me. It's complicated. You don't understand. What don't I understand? That my husband is gay? That our marriage was just a cover for you? I'm not gay! Alvin exploded. I love you! I love the kids. It's just a part of me that you can't accept. A part of you? Sandra jumped up. You call a 3-year affair a part of you? You see him twice a week. You make plans together. You buy him gifts. How do you know about the gifts? I know everything. The expensive watch you bought last month and told me was for a client. The bracelet you ordered online. You think I didn't check your credit card statements? Alvin realized he was trapped. All his lies, all his excuses crumbled like a house of cards. What about the kids? What am I going to tell the kids? Sandra's voice trembled. They don't need to know. They don't need to know that their father is a liar and a cheater, that their family was a sham. Our family is not a sham. I'm a good father. A good father doesn't destroy his family for sex with men. It's not just sex, Alvin shouted. I'm in love with him. For the first time in my life, I'm truly in love. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sandra looked at her husband, and in her eyes he saw not anger. Worse, he saw disgust. Get out, she said quietly. Sandy, get out of this house. Now, this is my house too. The children. The children shouldn't see you like this. They shouldn't know who their father really is. I haven't changed. I'm the same person. No, Sandra shook her head. You're a stranger. You've always been a stranger. I just didn't know it. Alvin tried to approach her again. We can work this out. We can go to a family therapist. Work it out? Sandra laughed bitterly. You think you can work out the fact that you're gay, that you love men, that our marriage was a mistake from the start? I'm not going to leave my family for him. Does he know about this? Does he know you're not going to leave your wife? Alvin was silent. Of course, Brian knew. It was the source of their constant conflicts, the inability to be together openly, the need to hide, to live on stolen moments. So you're cheating on him too, Sandra realized. You're promising something you're not going to give. The situation is complicated. Everything is complicated for you, Alvin. You've lived your whole life without making choices. You married me because it was the right thing to do. You had children because that's what you're supposed to do. You built a business because you had to provide for your family. But you always dreamed of men. It's not that simple. Then explain it to me. Explain how you can love two people at the same time. Explain how you can lie to my face every day. Alvin sat down on the sofa and put his head in his hands. I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't want to hurt me? Sandra's voice became dangerously quiet. You ruined my life. 20 years. I gave you the best years of my life. You had a good life. A house, children, stability. Had? As if you gave me anything. I worked just as hard as you did. I built this house, raised the children, supported your business. I know, and I'm grateful. Shut up, just shut up. Sandra grabbed the paperweight from the table that Alvin had given her on their last anniversary. You used me. I was your cover. No, I really love you. How can you love someone you constantly deceive? Alvin stood up and tried to take her hands. Sandy, please, Don't touch me! She pushed him away. Don't you dare touch me again. I'm your husband. You're nothing. You're empty. She swung the paperweight. Alvin tried to dodge it, but the heavy glass object hit him in the temple with such force that he fell, hitting his head on the corner of the coffee table. There was a dull thud, and Alvin lay motionless. Sandra stood over him, the paperweight in her hand, breathing heavily. Alvin? Alvin. He didn't answer. A dark pool slowly spread beneath his head. Sandra knelt down and tried to find his pulse. Nothing. Reality hit her like an avalanche. She had killed her husband. In a fit of rage, in a state of affect, but she had killed him. The children were now orphans. Her life was over. But then, as if from outside, the voice of a bank analyst accustomed to solving problems spoke in her head. If she called the police now and told them the truth, she would go to prison. Emily and Josh would find out not only that their father was gay, but also that their mother had killed him. The family would be destroyed forever. Sandra stood up and looked at the scattered photographs. She quickly gathered them up and put them in a folder. Then she took the paperweight, wiped it clean, and put it back in its place. She had to think. She went out the back door, walked around the house, and broke a window in the living room with a garden stone. Then she went back inside, knocked over a few items, and pulled out the drawers of the desk. She took cash from Alvin's wallet and took his watch. Half an hour later, she dialed 911. Help! Burglars have broken into our house. They killed my husband. Her voice sounded genuinely hysterical. The ambulance arrived first, followed by the police. Detective Mark Coleman showed up 20 minutes after the call. A 45-year-old veteran of the local police force, he had been investigating murders in the county for 15 years. Sandra sat in the kitchen, trembling and sobbing, in the arms of her neighbor, Mary Johnson. I was upstairs taking a bath, she said. I heard noise, screaming. When I came downstairs, the window was broken and Alvin was lying on the floor. Did you see the attackers? Detective Coleman asked. No, I was scared, so I locked myself in the bathroom and called the police. Coleman examined the crime scene. A broken window, signs of a struggle, overturned furniture. The victim was lying by the coffee table, apparently having hit his head when he fell. The wound on his temple matched the corner of the table. But something didn't add up. There was too little mess for a robbery. Thieves usually turned the house upside down, looking for valuables. Here, only the visible items in the living room had been touched. What was stolen? He asked. Cash from Alvin's wallet. His watch. Maybe something else. I didn't check. Coleman wrote down the answers, but an inner voice told him that Mrs. Harris's story was not complete. Over the years, he had learned to sense lies, and now something was definitely wrong. By midnight, the house was filled with neighbors, family friends, and relatives. Emily and Josh rushed over from the friend's house where they were staying for the night. Their grief was genuine and heartbreaking. The news of Alvin Harris's murder shook Franklin. By Saturday morning, half the town knew about the tragedy. Alvin was a respected member of the community, and his company provided jobs for dozens of families. The thought that someone could have killed him during a robbery frightened the residents of the quiet town. But Detective Coleman was in no hurry to jump to conclusions. Too many questions remained unanswered. Detective Mark Coleman didn't sleep all night. At 5:30 in the morning, he returned to the Harris's house to examine the crime scene in daylight. Experience told him that the first day of an investigation was the most important. That was when clues could be found that would later disappear or be destroyed. Yellow police tape cordoned off the house, and a patrol officer stood guard at the entrance. Coleman went into the living room and carefully examined the scene again. A broken window, an overturned floor lamp, drawers pulled out of the desk. At first glance, the picture looked convincing, but the details were alarming. The glass from the broken window was mostly outside, not inside the room. This meant that the blow had been struck from inside the house, not outside. Coleman photographed the shards and took measurements. The second inconsistency concerned the signs of a struggle. If the robbers had taken Alvin by surprise and he had resisted, there should have been marks on his hands, scratches, abrasions, broken nails. But the victim's hands were clean. Moreover, Alvin's clothes were not torn or wrinkled, as if he had fallen from the first blow. The third oddity was the choice of items stolen. The robbers took cash from the wallet and a watch, but left behind an expensive TV, a computer, and Sandra's jewelry, which were in plain sight in the bedroom. This was illogical for a typical robbery. Coleman called in a forensic expert to analyze the crime scene in detail. Tom Edwards arrived at 8 in the morning with a full set of equipment. "What do you think?" asked the detective as the expert examined the bloodstains. The nature of the wound suggests that the victim was first struck with something heavy on the temple, then fell and hit his head on the corner of the table. Tom pointed to the coffee table. The fall was fatal, but the first blow incapacitated him. The murder weapon? Something heavy with a smooth surface. Glass or metal? I didn't find it here. Coleman examined the items in the living room. On the desk was a glass paperweight, heavy, the right size, but there were no traces of blood or hair on it. Could this have been the weapon? He pointed to the paperweight. Tom picked up the object and examined it under a magnifying glass. Theoretically, yes, but it's too clean. If it was used to kill someone and then washed, there should be micro traces in the indentations. They sent the paperweight for examination. Coleman understood that even thorough cleaning could not completely remove all traces of DNA and blood. At 10 in the morning, the detective went to the morgue to attend the autopsy. Medical examiner Dr. Carol Lewis had been working in the county for 20 years and had a reputation for being very thorough. The cause of death was massive traumatic brain injury resulting from a blow to the head with a sharp object, she reported. The victim was first struck with a blunt object on the left temple. The blow was strong enough to cause loss of consciousness, but not fatal. Death was caused by a skull fracture sustained during the fall. Can you determine what object was used to deliver the first blow? Something heavy, round in shape. The diameter of the contact surface is about 3 inches, glass or smooth metal. The description matched the paperweight in the living room exactly. Now, here's an interesting detail. Dr. Lewis pointed to the deceased's hands. I found pieces of skin under the victim's fingernails. He was scratching or grabbing someone immediately before his death. Could these be marks left by the attackers? Possibly. But the location of the scratches suggests that he was more likely grabbing someone by the arms or shoulders, trying to hold them back or push them away. Coleman wrote down all the details. The picture was becoming more and more complicated. If Alvin had grabbed the attacker, there should be marks on that person's body. In the afternoon, the detective began interviewing witnesses. The first were the Harris's neighbors. Mary Johnson, who lived across the street, hadn't noticed anything suspicious. I went to bed around 10, she said. I didn't hear anything until the police arrived. Alvin's car was in the driveway, as usual. Tom Johnson, her husband, added an important detail. Around 10:30, I went out to walk the dog. I saw lights in the Harris's windows, but nothing unusual. This contradicted Sandra's testimony, who claimed that she had been taking a bath from 9:30 to 11. Next was Jim Wilson, Alvin's foreman. He talked about his boss's last days. Alvin was kind of nervous this week. He left several times during the day without explaining where he was going. That wasn't like him. Did he have any enemies? Alvin? No way. Everyone in town respected him. He didn't have any real competitors. We mainly built residential buildings, which isn't a very profitable business for large companies. Late in the evening, Coleman received the first results of the examination. Microscopic traces of blood and hair matching the victim's samples were indeed found on the paperweight. Someone had washed the item very thoroughly, but had not been able to clean it completely. The next day, the detective decided to take a closer look at Alvin's personal life. A computer examination of his phone and laptop yielded striking results. The browser history had been thoroughly cleared, but the technicians were able to recover some of the data. Alvin regularly visited gay dating sites, exchanged messages with several men on instant messengers, and booked motel rooms. His double life was systematic and well thought out. In his phone's contact list, there was a number listed as BT-Insurance. Coleman checked the number and found that it belonged to Brian Thompson, an insurance agent from Nashville. The trip to Nashville took an hour. Brian worked in a small insurance company office in the business district. Coleman introduced himself and asked for a meeting. "I'm investigating the murder of Alvin Harris," he said. "Your number was in his phone." Brian turned pale. "Murder? I thought it was a robbery. How did you know Mr. Harris?" "He was a client. He insured his construction sites." Brian nervously fiddled with the pen. "How often did you meet with him?" "As needed." When policies needed to be renewed, Coleman took out a printout of calls from Alvin's phone. "According to the records, you spoke with him almost every day for the last 3 years. A lot of policies to renew?" Brian realized he was trapped. "Detective, this is a complicated situation. Mr. Thompson, I'm investigating a murder. I advise you to tell the truth." Brian covered his face with his hands. "We met. Not for work. We had a relationship." "What kind?" "Romantic. We were lovers." The detective showed no surprise, although this explained many of the oddities in Alvin's behavior. "How long did it last?" 3 years. We met twice a week, usually at a motel in Columbia." "Did his wife know?" "No. At least we thought so. Alvin was very careful." "When did you last see him?" "On Thursday, the day before he died." Brian began to cry. He said he was having problems at home, that Sandra was asking questions. This was the first crack in Sandra's story. If Alvin suspected his wife knew something, it meant there had already been conflicts between them. What exactly was he worried about? Sandra was asking about his business trips. She was checking his stories. Alvin was afraid she had hired a private investigator. Back in Franklin, Coleman decided to check Sandra's financial records. A request to the bank showed that 2 weeks before the murder, she had withdrawn $5,000 in cash from her account. The amount was unusually large for family expenses. The detective found advertisements for private investigators in neighboring counties on the internet. One of them, Ray McConnell, confirmed that he had worked with a client named Sandra who suspected her husband of cheating. "She paid me to watch her husband," McConnell said over the phone. The results were pretty clear. The man was meeting with other men. "When did you give her the report?" "Last Monday. 4 days before the murder." The final piece of the puzzle came from bartender Jason Miller. Coleman found him at the Crossroads bar and showed him a photo of Alvin. "Yes, I knew him," Jason said. "He used to come here sometimes." He called himself Al. "How often?" "Once a month, maybe. Last saw him about 3 weeks ago. Did he meet anyone here?" "Me, a few times. But he had someone serious, a married man like himself." Now Coleman had the full picture. Sandra found out about her husband's double life, got the detective's report, confronted Alvin and killed him in a fight. Then she staged a robbery. On Tuesday, a week after the murder, the detective invited Sandra to the station for further questioning. She came accompanied by a lawyer, which was already a suspicious sign. "Mrs. Harris, I need to clarify some details," Coleman began. "You said you were taking a bath from 9:30 to 11. "Yes." but your neighbor saw the light in the living room at 10:30. If you were in the bathroom, who was downstairs? Sandra hesitated for a moment. Maybe I had already gotten out of the bath. I don't remember the exact time. Did you know that your husband was seeing other men? The lawyer tried to intervene, but Sandra had already answered. What do you mean? Your husband had a romantic relationship with Brian Thompson. It lasted 3 years. Sandra's face turned to stone. I don't know what you're talking about. We found a report by private investigator Ray McConnell. You hired him to follow your husband. I have the right to hire detectives. Of course. But it's interesting that you received the report 4 days before the murder. It contained photos of your husband with his lover. The lawyer demanded that the questioning be stopped, but Coleman continued. Mrs. Harris, we have an analysis of the paperweight from your living room. Your husband's blood and hair were found on it. It is the murder weapon. Sandra was silent, but her hands were shaking. Particles of skin were found under your husband's fingernails. Show me your hands. Sandra instinctively hid her hands under the table. Coleman noticed healing scratches on her wrists. It happened during an argument, didn't it? You found out about his affair and made a scene. He tried to hold you back and scratched your hands, and you hit him with the paperweight. That's not true. The glass was broken from inside the house. They staged a robbery. But they forgot that modern forensics can find traces even after thorough cleaning. Sandra looked at the lawyer, then at the detective. There was no longer any hope in her eyes, only fatigue. He ruined my life, she said quietly. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of lies. Sandra, don't say anything else, the lawyer asked. No, she shook her head. Let everyone know the truth. Let them know who he really was. And she told everything. How she discovered his infidelity, about the photos and the detective's report, about the last argument when Alvin admitted that he loved Brian more than her, about the moment when anger and pain turned into rage. I didn't plan to kill him, she concluded. I just couldn't take his lies anymore. Sandra was arrested on charges of second-degree murder. Emily and Josh stayed with their grandmother, Sandra's mother. The story of Alvin's double life became public knowledge, shocking conservative Franklin. Brian Thompson lost his job after his employer learned of the scandal. His wife filed for divorce. He moved to another state, trying to start a new life. Jason Miller gave an interview to a local newspaper about how difficult it is to be gay in a conservative community. His words sparked a painful but necessary conversation about tolerance in the town. Sandra was sentenced to 15 years in prison. At the trial, she said, I don't justify what I did. But I want people to understand that lies kill. If Alvin had been honest from the beginning, we could all have avoided this tragedy. The house on Maple Street was sold. Emily received a scholarship and enrolled at Vanderbilt University. Josh moved to California to live with his uncle. Harris Construction was shut down,